Record here.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. As Sarah said, we're glad you joined us. If you're just coming in, feel free to put in the chat where you are from and a story, concern, or question related to child identity theft. We are excited to have you here. Axton, if you'd advance the slide. We would like to start our poll today, just asking about why are you participating in today's webinar? So the poll is launched, and just put if it's for personal use, for professional use, or for both personal and professional use. Kind of gives us an idea of who's attending our webinars with the University of Minnesota Extension, and topics that pertain to professionals or personal, or if people are coming for both. We've noticed most people are coming a little bit for both. So we'll give you just a few more seconds. I'll do a quick introduction. My name is Sam Roth, and I'm a University of Minnesota Extension educator with Scott and Carver counties, and Sarah Krymans is a regional educator for the University of Minnesota Extension. We both do financial capability. And today we're excited to have Axton Betz-Hamilton from South Dakota State University join us. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and it looks like 60% of you are here for personal and professional use, and 40% for personal use. Our next slide, I believe I get to turn it over to Axton, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And Axton, are you okay introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me today. So as Sam shared, I will be talking today about child identity theft. A lot of what I'll share will come from the perspective of familial identity theft. So what I focus on is cases where a family member has stolen that child's identity for the most part. And you'll see if you're not familiar with my story already, that the reason for that is personal experience. I have a lot of experience with identity theft, particularly familial and child identity theft on a personal level, and that shaped my career. I am an assistant professor and the undergraduate program coordinator for the Consumer Affairs program at South Dakota State University in Brookings. And my primary research focus, I used to say identity theft, but I've broadened that a little bit. If you're familiar with the elder family financial exploitation work that's been done now for several years with the University of Minnesota Extension under Marlene Stamm, um, I work with her quite a bit actually, because like me, she focuses on uh, financial abuse within a family. And she just focuses on older adults, whereas I was focusing on more on children. So elder family financial exploitation and child identity theft by family members, they can be viewed as financial abuse within families. Um, and again, my focus is due to personal experience. So, my personal experience is that my identity was stolen when I was 11 years old back in 1993. I was doing a podcast the other day, and the host said, "Wow, that's been almost 30 years ago." And I felt really old. Um, it doesn't seem like it's been that long, but so I've lived with identity theft either as a victim or as a professional for most of my life. And in a nutshell, I didn't discover that my identity had been stolen until I was 19, and didn't identify the offender until I was 31. So it was a 20-year process. Generally, cases that old don't get solved. It was kind of by accident and through a tragedy that it was revealed who was responsible. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But I want to go over just where we're headed in this presentation. So we're going to start off with some polls just to assess your knowledge And it sounds like from the chat that many of you were drawn here for both personal and professional reasons. I did see that there is a victim in the group today and a social worker. So a lot of you likely have some prior knowledge and some experiences. So I look forward to learning more about those through the polls and through the chat. I'll share some stories of child identity theft. So I'll go deeper into my own story, and I'll share some stories from the research studies that I've conducted and am conducting. I have one ongoing right now. I'll then share what we can learn from these stories, and then I will talk about how to uh, prevent, detect, and repair the damage. So let's check your knowledge with some polls. So first question is, in 2017, how many children were victims of identity theft? Is it 250,000, 500,000, 1 million, or 2 million?
And just so everybody knows, there are 4 questions for this poll. So if you just scroll down, you'll get to question 2, answer that, and then to question 3, and then question 4, and then that's when you're done.
Oh, thanks, Sam, for clarifying that. Yeah, I didn't mean to leave you hanging there with leaving or with just reading just the first question there. So, but it looks like
Yep.
folks are finding the all the questions and clicking on the appropriate responses.
We have everybody about 30 more seconds to complete the poll. All right, I'll end the poll. And then should I share results, Axton, and then you can talk about each one?
Sure.
Okay.
So in 2017, how many children were victims of identity theft? Most of you are correct. It is 1 million. That's awesome. I feel like some of you might have read some of my papers or viewed some of the same studies that I have. Question 2, what percent of children will be identity theft victims before turning age 18? So the correct answer here is 30%, and this comes from Experian. So it's an estimate that 30% of all children will be identity theft victims before they turn age 18. And then what percent of identity theft perpetrators steal the identity of a family member? That's also 30%. I I I like that many of you chose 40%. Again, numbers like this are just estimates. It's very possible that the number's higher because, again, a lot of these cases are not reported or they're not reported correctly. And then, who are the number one perpetrators of child identity theft? Most of you got it. It is parents. And there are multiple sources out there that say parents are the number one perpetrators.
Just so everybody knows, if your poll is still on your screen, you will just need to close it. Some people's Zooms do that and others automatically close it. And
Okay.
Axton, before you move on, there was a question
Oh, sure.
about in the 2017,
Yeah.
what was the source for the first question? Was that from research or consumer?
So it
Excellent.
was from Javelin Strategy and Research Report. So they're an independent research firm, and they were doing child identity theft studies, I believe, every year. It might have been every two. Um, but they were doing them regularly. The last one, I believe, was in 2017. So they've done some work on identity theft since then, but they haven't focused specifically on child identity theft. Okay, so I just a little bit of a recap of what was shared in the polls, and I see that I misspoke on one of them. Oops. So 1 million children were victims of identity theft in 2017, and that comes from a Javelin Strategy and Research study, which, if you're interested in that study, I can certainly send you the link for that. And then this is where I misspoke. An estimated 25% of children will be identity theft victims before turning age 18. I used 30 for that question on the poll, so I apologize for that. And then 30% of identity theft perpetrators steal the identity of a family member, in part because it's easy access. In the cases of parents who steal children's identities, they know the child's birth date, they know their social security number, they know their mother's maiden name, they know all that pertinent information that's relevant to um, establishing credit or a bank account or whatever it is that they want to do with that child's identity. So I mentioned that child identity theft is often underreported, and that's because it's often undetected. And because of this underreporting, the prevalence data are difficult to obtain. So any prevalence statistics that you see, like 1 million children were victims of identity theft in 2017, that's likely low. Because of this underreporting, we just don't have accurate prevalence data. And again, parents are the number one perpetrators of child identity theft. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and get into some stories of child identity theft. Again, I'll start with my story, in part because I know the most about it, and my story spans 20 years, so there are a lot of details there. And I think my story is pretty unique in how it came to its resolution. So my story is actually the focus of a book that was published in 2019. So it's a memoir called "The Less People Know About Us." I am not the adult on the cover. The first time I showed the book cover to my colleagues here at SDSU, one of them said, "Whose baby are you holding?" I'm the baby. I'm not the adult. Yeah, that's my mom in the photo. I I know I look a lot like my mom, but I am the baby. So again, my identity was stolen in 1993. I was 11 years old, and I knew at the time that my parents' identities had been stolen, but no one knew what child identity theft was back then. People barely knew what identity theft was back then. In fact, identity theft was not considered a crime against consumers until the Identity Theft Assumption and Deterrence Act of 1998. So, for the first 5 years that my parents were victims, in the eyes of the law, they were not victims. The creditors that had extended credit to the identity thieves were the victims. So, there really wasn't a lot of recourse for my parents, at least from 1993 to 1998. Um, so I watched my parents struggle with recovering from identity theft unsuccessfully. And with their identity theft, they had credit cards taken out in their name, fraudulent utility accounts. Our mail was being stolen, and it felt very personal because the mail that was being stolen wasn't just bills and documents that had personal information on them. It was fun stuff like my dad's farm magazines and my pen pal letters, because back then we wrote letters. We didn't have Snapchat and Facebook and things like that. And so I went away to college in 2000 and thought that by doing so, I was getting away from the identity theft and that the identity thief that had caused so much turmoil with my parents wouldn't find me. They wouldn't follow me. They wouldn't be able to because I was going to college at Purdue, 100 miles from home. I was so wrong about that. So I didn't realize I was a victim of identity theft as well until 2001 when I moved off campus and got my first teeny tiny little studio apartment. And I called the electric company to establish service, and they told me the date and time they would be there. And thought, oh, this, everything's going fine. Life is good. We're getting things set up in this apartment. And they sent me a letter a few days later that said, we need a $100 deposit due to your credit score. And I thought it was because I didn't have one. I should have really had one. And there was a number to call at the bottom of the letter to get a free copy of my credit report. And I called it out of curiosity because I didn't know what a credit report was. I wanted to see what I thought was this mysterious agency, what they were keeping on me in this report. And about 6 weeks later, a large manila envelope from the credit reporting agency arrived in the mail. And I was so naive that I thought that credit reports must be really hard to read. They must come with a lot of instructions and disclosures because there's no way my credit report can be this thick. And I opened the envelope and very quickly realized that credit reports are not difficult to read at all. They don't come with a lot of instructions or disclosures, but rather my credit report was 10 pages long, full of fraudulent uh, credit card account entries and associated collection agency entries that dated back to the time that my parents' identities had been stolen in 1993. So it could be assumed that the person responsible for their identity theft was also responsible for mine. So, as a result of that experience and really struggling to recover from identity theft, because those of you who are victims will probably really understand me when I say this is a crime where you are guilty until you're proven innocent. It's your name, it's your social security number, therefore it's your debt. And that's often how you're treated. And in the process of attempting to recover from the identity theft and having customer service agents tell me that no, you're not a victim of identity theft because someone made X number of payments on this account, and identity thieves don't do that. Or, well, your name and social security number match what's on the account, so it's your debt. Um, very early on in this process, I realized I had a fight on my hands and that it was going to be a long, frustrating process to clear my credit report. And so while I was working on that, I was also working to establish good credit in my name, legitimate credit that I went out and applied for. The first legitimate credit in my name was a credit card, and this was the platinum credit card that I got through this company. So I really hate to think of what, the gold and silver members received in with regard to their terms, because I had a $69 annual fee that they assessed before they even mailed me the credit card. The credit card had a $300 limit and a 29.99% APR. Shortly thereafter, and by shortly I mean about a month after, the car that I was driving wasn't worth repairing. And so I was able to get a car loan after driving from dealership to dealership to dealership to dealership in a borrowed car. And I set off at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. I didn't get home till 7 o'clock that night. And the last place I stopped, and again, 100 miles from home, was willing to give me special financing, which is, of course, not good terms, on a 5-year-old used car. And the APR on that loan was 18.23%. That's like putting a used car on a credit card. I've had to pay deposits for utility services, so telephone service, electric service, cable TV service. I've had to pay higher auto insurance rates because of my credit score. So I had to do that through 2009. And the reason that went until 2009 is because my credit report didn't clear fraudulent entries until then. So some of them aged off regardless of how many times I disputed uh, the fraudulent entries. So some of the emotional impacts were isolation. So because of how prolonged and pervasive the identity theft was in my family, my parents felt it was someone very close to them, like an extended relative or a friend of the family. So we self-isolated. We just closed off from those relationships. And we didn't say, we think you're the identity thief or anything like that. We just withdrew, very quietly withdrew, um, didn't have family gatherings, didn't go over to people's houses. We just stayed at home and stayed to ourselves. I was taught not to trust other people. Um, a really good example of that, and I go into this in detail in my book, is my grandfather lived next door to us. And he had hired a plumber, but he didn't tell anybody. So he didn't tell dad, he didn't tell mom, he didn't say anything to me. And I was a teenager at the time, and I saw this beat up looking van pull into our driveway. And one of the rules that I was taught growing up is that if they go across the gate, and we had a gate that separated the front part of our property from the back part of our property, if they go through the gate, you have to take care of it because we didn't have a phone. We didn't really trust the police because they didn't help with the identity theft situation. I was taught you have to handle it. But the line that was to be crossed before I had to handle it was if they go through the gate. They went through the gate. This scruffy looking guy in this beat up van that I didn't recognize. So I slipped on my mom's very old, very ripped up, dirty barn tennis shoes. I was still in pajamas. So this was summertime. It was like, you know, 9, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm still wearing my mauve colored pajamas. I don't know why I remember that detail, but I do. And grabbed the biggest butcher knife I could find in the kitchen, slinked out the back door, and slinked behind trees and walked up very softly behind him as he was walking down the driveway with the knife in the air. And I started screaming, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I did end up chasing him off. He told me he was a plumber and that my grandfather had hired him, and I didn't believe it because, again, I was taught not to trust anyone or anything anybody said. I was also very hyper vigilant in terms of always being aware of what was going on around me, who was around me. So if we were in public at a store, I was always aware of who was around me, who was behind me, in front of me, beside me. I'd wonder if, the person beside me was the identity thief. Um, so I was always on guard. So now I'm going to share some stories briefly of some uh, participants in my research studies. So I primarily conduct qualitative research where I interview victims of identity theft about their experience and about the offender. And Scarlett, and again, this is a pseudonym. Her identity was stolen by her father at age 6, and it was used to establish a fraudulent business and avoid paying taxes. So her father did not want to pay the business taxes, so he used his daughter's identity. In Scarlett's case, as is true with many of the victims that I interview for my studies, they're victims of multiple types of abuse within the family. And one of the things that I've started saying is that identity theft, particularly by a parent, um, it, it's a tool in the abuser's toolbox. because more often than not, there's some other form of abuse going on as well. And in Scarlett's case, that was definitely true. Her father sold her into human trafficking, and her father also had a lengthy criminal history. She was able to get out of the human trafficking with help from some human services agencies, but she did spend her high school years homeless. She lived in the woods, but she still went to school. And again, she received assistance in recovering from identity theft from youth program staff. So she was going to a youth program for help with her homework and getting some meals through that program. And they also provided some help in recovering from the identity theft. Um, Scarlett expressed fear and distrust of parents in general, as well as government agencies. And she has empathy for her current clients, and she works in the medical field. So she works with clients who express concern about identity theft and medical identity theft. And so she feels that she has a special empathy for that based on her experience. So Darwin's story, again, another pseudonym. His identity was stolen by his father either at the age of 23 or 24 to establish utilities and obtain a mortgage. Like in many cases of identity theft perpetrated by a family member, multiple family members' identities were stolen within Darwin's family, as was the case with mine. There was marital discord as well. In fact, in Darwin's case, his father went out and had a second family while he was still married to Darwin's mom. Uh, and Darwin expressed mistrust of financial institution employees who ask for personal information, even if he initiates the contact, would say a bank or a credit union. And he expressed that there were limited resources in his rural location to assist victims. So Sassy's story, her father stole her identity at the age of 11 to obtain student loans. She said her father was concerned with how others perceived the family, so very, very image conscious. And because of this, um, and how she felt that that image consciousness with always having a new car and having the biggest house on the block and the only house on the block that had an in-ground swimming pool, those kinds of things, she felt that that played a role in the identity theft and may have been a motivation for her father to commit the identity theft. And so because of that, Sassy rejects this concern with how others perceive her family now as an adult. She expressed that moving to a rural area made it easier for members of the family to keep things hidden from others. So there was definitely some isolation in her experience. And interestingly, her father had a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And to me, this is important, and it does reveal a bias of mine with research. I think my mom, who was the one who stole my identity, so her identity was never stolen. So that's part of what happened to me. And so mom lied about her identity being stolen for 20 years, but she stole dad's identity, my identity, and my grandfather's identity. And we had never known that his had been stolen. I do think, based on her behavior, she likely had a personality disorder as well, likely antisocial personality disorder. So I talk about psychopathy in the book. Psychopathy has been captured by antisocial personality disorder in the DSM-5. And I just think it's interesting that Sassy's father was actually diagnosed with this. So, you know, more research is needed here, but I do think that offenders likely have some sort of mental health issue by and large. Not always, but by and large. Sonny's story, so this is from a study that I'm currently conducting. His identity was stolen by his mother while he was in college. And what Sonny's mother did was she took over his existing checking account. So she just started signing his name to checks that he had left in a drawer at home while he was away at college. Um, Sonny's mother also engaged in emotional and physical abuse in addition to the identity theft. And an outcome of this for Sonny is because of the emotional abuse, the physical abuse, the identity theft, all of that wrapped together and the trauma associated with all of this, he's underemployed. So he's working part-time in a manual labor position, not making much money when he has two college degrees and can do better. And he told me he knows he can do better, but there's just so much trauma there that, it's an effort to apply for a better job. It's an effort to uh, think about working full time versus part time. So, uh, you know, this case I think highlights the trauma that can occur with these cases. Now, in or not Sassy, Scarlett's story, and with the human trafficking, she was very resilient. She's doing very well now. This is a case where, um, the trauma of the situation has really had a negative impact on the victim. So, what can we learn from these stories? If a family member is the offender, other concurrent forms of abuse are likely. Um, Oftentimes, in cases where a family member is the perpetrator, they're not just stealing that one child's identity or that one family member's identity. They're stealing everybody's within the family, usually the immediate family. The emotional impacts of this type of victimization may be more salient than financial impacts, and some common emotional impacts that participants share with me are feelings of mistrust and feelings of fear. And that fear can be associated with what happened once, it could happen again. And how do I stop it from happening again? It's this anticipatory anxiety over waiting for the next shoe to drop. Because with identity theft, and for those of you who are victims, you'll likely understand me when I say the other shoe always finds a way to drop. And that's something that victims can carry with them for years. The mistrust can be directed towards family members, can be directed towards just people in general, or it can be directed to financial institutions that allowed the identity theft to establish fraudulent accounts in the victim's name. As seen from these stories, victims may have a thread of resilience that should be highlighted and encouraged in working with victims. And something that I've noticed more and more in my research is that victims are reporting that uh, the family member perpetrator is finding or found ways to socially isolate them. So that was true in my case. It was true in Sunny's case. It was true in Scarlett's case as well. So now I want to shift gears and talk about protecting children from identity theft victimization. So, first and foremost, don't provide a child's personal information to those who have no need for it. Personal information meaning things like social security number, their date of birth, their mother's maiden name. One of the easiest avenues for identity thieves to obtain this information is through Facebook. Think of all of the parents that post pictures of their child's birthday party, or just post information about, maybe it's an invite to the child's birthday party. Um, that's information that an identity thief could use to establish fraudulent accounts in your child's name. Also, mother's maiden name is another key to your identity. And there are a lot of women on social media, particularly Facebook, who use their maiden name, and it's innocent enough. They're trying to connect with high school friends, usually, and again, that's a key to your child's identity. So, I encourage you to not have that information on social media. One thing you can do as a parent is you can freeze your child's credit. And so, what a credit freeze does, so you can contact each of the three credit reporting agencies, and those are Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, and request to freeze your child's credit. You'll have to send in some documentation, such as, you know, the child's birth certificates, and to show that you are indeed, the child's parent. Um, and there will be forms and other things you have to fill out. So it's a little bit of a process. It's a little more involved than freezing an adult's credit, but it is worthwhile, particularly if you're concerned about uh, identity theft. Um, and then one way to prevent child identity theft is we really need to enhance the protections and the services for children who are victims of abuse. So again, one of the things that I'm seeing in my research is parents who steal children's identities are often engaging in other forms of abuse towards that child. Most commonly emotional abuse, but again, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect can be present as well. And those different types of abuse are more understood. They're more likely to be referred to Child Protective Services. And so just making sure that um, exploring for financial abuse of that child is done by CPS or another child welfare agency. Just making sure that that's done while those agencies are involved with that child, I think is critical. So detecting child identity theft.
Axton, we've got a quick question in the chat. How long
Sure.
do you freeze a child's credit?
Oh, how do you freeze a child's credit?
How long? For what term of time?
So you can freeze it up until they're 18. Now, to initiate the freeze, and this is, I don't really understand the logic behind this, but the child has to be 16 years of age or younger, but it can be frozen all the way until they're 18. So if you have a 17-year-old, you can't freeze their credit, but if you do it before they're 16 or under, then that can be frozen all the way until they become a legal adult.
And is it true that adults can freeze their own credit reports if they're concerned as well?
Absolutely. And one thing I should point out is that um, it is free to freeze your credit report and your child's credit report. And for adults, you can uh, contact the three credit reporting agencies and freeze your credit. They'll give you a PIN as part of that process, and you'll want that PIN number in the event that you want to unfreeze your credit. So when you freeze your credit, no one can access your credit other than you. And that's only if you lift it with the PIN. So that PIN number is literally the key that fits the lock that allows access to your credit. So let's say you freeze your credit and you decide you want to go out and buy a new car, and you want to uh, finance that purchase. And say you're sitting in the finance office at the dealership, and unless you have called the credit reporting agency to lift that freeze temporarily, your car loan won't go through. So it's a little bit clunky. to, I think, if you're in the heat of the moment and you want to make that purchase, you do have to pause and make the effort to contact the credit reporting agencies, lift that freeze, and then once you're done with that transaction, let's say it's getting that car loan, you have to make sure you go back and contact the credit reporting agencies and put the freeze back on. So it's a little clunky. I will say that the upshot to it is that it reduces the likelihood of impulse purchases because you do have to freeze and unfreeze your credit. But again, it's a free process. What it does is that for identity theft victims is that it stops any additional new accounts from being opened in their name. So it doesn't stop any fraud with existing accounts, but it minimizes the damage with regard to new accounts being established in the victim's name. So signs that your child has been a victim of identity theft. So if you start receiving pre-approved credit offers in your child's name, that's a red flag that they have a credit file. You can do a minor credit check with the credit reporting agencies to dig a little deeper to see if a credit file exists. And it's a little bit of a bit more involved of a process than, say, going to annualcreditreport.com for an adult and checking their credit report, because minors aren't supposed to have a credit report. So you can provide documentation to the credit reporting agencies, and they will do a minor credit check and provide you with the results of that investigation as their parent. And I mentioned this before. In cases of child abuse, the child's credit should also be checked. I know that's something that occurs regularly now in cases of children in foster care, and I do know that children in foster care do get assistance with identity theft while they're in care, but that should extend to all victims of child abuse, regardless of whether they are in foster care. So helping child victims. So I am an accredited financial counselor, and one of the things that we learned very early on as part of that accreditation uh, process is you have to stay in your lane, meaning stay within your professional scope of practice. I'm sure that's true for other credentials and other licensing bodies as well. And your credentialing and or licensing body has information defining your professional scope of practice. The consequences for going beyond your professional scope of practice can be that you get into trouble with your credentialing or licensing body, and you may lose that credential. So you want to make sure you stay within your professional scope of practice. The challenge with that in working with identity theft victims is that we're messy. And I say that I'm a victim of child identity theft. We bring a lot of issues to the table, not just financial issues, but we can bring a lot of emotional issues to the table. We can bring physical issues to the table because identity theft is a stressful experience. It can have physical ramifications like insomnia and digestive issues and chronic pain. So when we see a professional as a victim, we're probably going to tell you everything. And while we as professionals may want to help the victim with everything that they bring to us, based on the standards within our credentialing or licensing body, we can't do that. So it's something to keep in mind. So questions to ask yourself as a professional is, who is your client? So ask yourself, is the victim 18 years old or older? If not, the parent or guardian is likely your client, because if the victim is under the age of 18, then the parent or guardian is technically responsible for working to clear the child's identity of any fraudulent information. Also, ask yourself, are there other forms of abuse occurring or suspected? And if so, are you a mandated reporter? So you might have to report that there are signs of physical abuse or neglect or sexual abuse. And unfortunately, and I say that from the accredited financial counselor standpoint, um, that might get more attention than the identity theft. The identity theft in these cases often gets overshadowed by the other forms of abuse that are co-occurring. So steps that need to be taken to recover are: a complaint needs to be filed with law enforcement. This is usually the biggest stumbling block if the perpetrator is a family member. Most of the victims who have participated in my studies have not filed a police report because they don't want to get the family member in trouble, or or the family member's already been in so much trouble they don't think it will matter, because previous police reports haven't deterred this family member from criminal activity. They don't want to start additional conflicts within the family. So filing a complaint with law enforcement is usually the biggest barrier for victims in recovering from identity theft, particularly in cases of familial and child identity theft. Victims should, if they're adults, should obtain a copy of their credit report using annualcreditreport.com. It's the only site that will give free access to your credit report from all three of the credit reporting agencies with no strings attached. So you don't have to sign up for anything. You just go to that website, put in your personal information, and you can get access to all three of reports from the credit bureaus. It is important to advise victims to get all three of their credit reports because creditors are not required to report to all three. So if let's say a victim just gets their Experian report, well, there might be a fraudulent account showing up on their TransUnion account or report that is not on their Experian report. So there could be undetected damage there if all three reports are not obtained. So consider a credit freeze. We've already talked about that. Dispute fraudulent accounts with credit bureaus and original creditors. You'll likely need to send evidence along with those disputes. You might have to file a fraud affidavit. That evidence will likely be a police report as well. Because and the reason for that is there are people out there who will establish credit cards and other accounts, not pay them, and then falsely claim identity theft. So that police report generally is evidence that you are indeed truly a victim of identity theft. You'll also want to have the victim obtain a Social Security earnings statement from the Social Security Administration. Now, these are supposed to be mailed out to you every year starting at the age of 25. In my experience, the SSA is hit or miss on that. But you can go online and access your Social Security Administration earnings statement at any time. And what this report can indicate is if your identity is being used for employment fraud. So look carefully at the amount of credits that are being shown as earned every year. Look carefully at the dollar amounts that are being reported. And if it doesn't seem accurate, contact the Social Security Administration for more details and to investigate more thoroughly if your identity is being used for employment fraud. So a note about emotional effects. So I've alluded to this already, but the victim client is likely going to present with a range of different emotions as they navigate the recovery process. So frustration, it's a very common emotion that victims go through because, and I say this from personal experience, you can feel like you're beating your head against a wall trying to get customer service representatives with creditors and collection agencies and credit reporting agencies to understand, yes, you are indeed a victim of identity theft. Um, Victims often feel anger that this has happened to them. Um, in cases where a family member is the perpetrator, they can feel unsupported, particularly by other family members. And it's important to note that family bonds are frequently broken as a result of child identity theft. This is actually a challenge that I've encountered with my research, as with qualitative studies, you often want to triangulate what the victim is saying with what others in the family have experienced. And so to do that, you ideally want to interview the victim and another family member. It doesn't have to be the offender, but just another family member. In most of these cases, the family bonds have been so irreparably broken that there are no other family members who are willing to engage with that other family member. So the victim doesn't even feel comfortable asking other family members to participate in the study. Um, so the recovery process in itself can be very isolating in terms of the damage that it causes to family relationships. Victims also can feel embarrassment and feeling like no one understands his or her situation. Um, and so you want to acknowledge but refer to a qualified mental health professional if the client's emotional concerns extend beyond your scope of practice. So I know some of you are in social work and other mental health areas. For those of you who are in more of the financial space, financial counseling and planning, you're likely going to want to refer out if a client's emotional concerns are beyond what you can handle in your professional role. So I've been talking a lot. And so I am curious about what questions you have and just want to open the chat up for questions, comments, concerns, for as long as anybody would like to stay.
So we invite you to put your questions in the chat. We did have somebody ask we'll send a link about how to check your minors' children's credit in the email going out to be able to walk them through that. And so while we're waiting for questions in the chat, I believe we caught all the ones from earlier. We'll just say thank you to everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. As Axton said, we'll stick around for a bit to be able to answer questions. We do invite you, if you would go to the next slide, if you need a certificate of participation, you can complete the webinar evaluation using the link and on the next slide to request a certificate. So on the next slide, it'll show you that link, and Sarah also put that into the chat. We do ask that you complete a short evaluation, and we will send a follow-up email to share with you the information and resources that we will have for this webinar. And I will send a sooner webinar, and then we'll also do it in a couple of months. And we have, we'll also, yes, Beth, we'll include the link information about the book in the follow-up email where they, what the name and the title and places that they can purchase it as well if you would like to. We do have some more upcoming webinars, and the next two slides show them. We've kind of put them all together. So you've attended the first one of identity theft and scams. This is on Tuesdays at 11. We have identity theft, be aware, financial exploitation of older adults, and beware of financial scams coming up. And then we also have how to avoid scams, which will be presented in Spanish. We also have topics about what's for dinner, our Minnesota communities and you. On the next slide, we also have The rest of our topics of all the webinars that are being offered in Spanish, in this together, supporting the needs and families and communities, and making sense of it all. So if you'd like to join us, we invite you, and this will be included in the follow-up email as well. And so we'll hang out and wait for any more questions to come in. We are a small group, so if you'd prefer to unmute yourself, you can do that and just ask the question as well.
Axton, this is Sarah. While we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions, how often do you suggest folks check their own credit report?
So if you're not concerned about identity theft, what I recommend is go on annualcreditreport.com, put in your personal information, and then choose one of the 3 credit reports, and then 4 months later go back in and get the next one, and then 4 months later go back in and get the next one. So you're staggering getting those credit reports, and that can help you be aware of any changes that could be ongoing that you may not be aware of, that could be fraudulent, or just could be errors. There are a lot of errors in credit reports, unfortunately.
I have a question. You had said that it was your mother who stole your, and then she also stole your grandfathers and fathers as well?
Yes.
And so I'm guessing your family never reported her?
Oh, that's a really big piece I left out of my explanation. So my mom passed away on February 12th of 2013. We discovered she was the offender on February 25th.
Oh,
So
wow.
we were never able to report her.
Okay. Wow. All right. It doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. Again, we invite you to take the feedback survey. That'll also be included in the follow-up email as well. And we do appreciate you joining. We'll hang out for just a few more minutes for any of those who might still be typing. Sometimes our questions are long. If not, thank you for attending.